Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bulkley Valley Research Center seminar series. We're very pleased to have you all with us today. My name is Dawn Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center, and we're very excited about the seminar presentation from Kira Hoffman today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gitumden clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and I'm in Telkwa on the banks of the Bulkley River. I'd also like to acknowledge our funders that help make this seminar series possible. First of all, are the supporting members of the Research Center. We thank you for your contribution and your ongoing faith and support in the center and the way it can support research in Northwest BC. I'd like to also thank the Wet'suwet'en Community Forest, the BC Government Gaming Fund, Bulkley Valley Community Foundation, and Bulkley Valley Credit Union. Their support is also instrumental in the success of our seminar series. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kira Hoffman. She's a jointly appointed postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia and with the Bulkley Valley Research Center. She's a certified fire ecologist and former wildland firefighter. Her research is focusing on how humans have used fire for millennia to manage and enhance their natural surroundings. And her research is assessing how to manage and enhance how present-day forests have been shaped by stewardship techniques such as burning, and how ongoing fire suppression has eroded the resiliency of fire-adapted landscapes. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kira. Thanks very much.
Okay, so thanks for having me. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And if something happens, just let me know so I don't continue on into the void for some reason. So I'll just jump right into it. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. If you do want to throw a question into the chat, feel free to do so. I probably won't see it, but we can then reflect on them at the end. So yes, I am coming to you from Smithers, and I'm what you'd call a ghost doc. So I haven't actually set foot for quite a few years at the UBC campus, but my research is very applied, and so much of it is on the ground in Northern British Columbia. And I'll be sharing some of the kind of highlights of the research that I've been working on for the last few years. Okay. Let me just try and advance here. There we go. So a little bit about me. It's always nice to kind of provide some context for how my research has, shaped me and how I've come to kind of like choose the research path that I'm on. So I grew up in Northern British Columbia in Smithers. For those of you who are tuning in from afar, this is near the Panhandle of Alaska, near the Yukon border. It's in Northern British Columbia. And I grew up on a small farm where we regularly burned our fields, sometimes successfully. And I have to say that I've always been interested in fire and human relationships. I'm a proud pyrophile. And my background's actually in fire suppression. So like Dawn said, I'm a former wildfire fighter. I was on a helitech crew in Northern and Southern British Columbia for quite a few years. And it was really during this time engaging in fire suppression that really sparked my interest in fire ecology. So I can really remember the exact fire that I went to when I started to question some of the fire suppression tactics that we were using. It was a lightning fire on an island, and the island was about the size of a house. A single tree was on fire, and we hover exited, we landed, and we put this fire out. And I started to kind of wonder, like, well, what values were at risk there? Was that fire actually going to do anything? Likely not. And so that was kind of an unpopular opinion to have 15 years ago. And it really kind of shaped my research questions that I still am trying to answer today. So my PhD is in fire ecology, and I'm actually right now in training to become a burn boss and an ignition specialist. So working definitely more on the applied side of things. So my research is really interdisciplinary. I rely on many, many different methods. I'm kind of one part dendroecologist, one part forester, historian, and I'm definitely a middle of the road botanist. call it kind of all under the umbrella of fire ecology. So I use remote sensing, historical photographs, but I'm definitely happiest when I'm out in the field learning about all different types of fire and searching for fire scars, which probably many of you know, as you can't walk through a forest without me just kind of hunting for them. So I really engage in collaborative research. So I've been really fortunate to work closely and learn from Indigenous knowledge holders, fire practitioners, government agencies, and of course, fire experts and community partners. Much of the work that I do is co-led by other scientists, and as well as collaborators who come from other worldviews. And I think it's really important to recognize that, as a white settler, I'm in a privileged position to learn about fire ecology. But I've also want to recognize that I've overcome a lot of different hurdles as a woman in fire science to be kind of where I am today. So women really do bring diverse perspectives to wildfire. And in Canada, women are disproportionately impacted both directly and indirectly by wildfire. So this is an area of research that I'm really interested in, and I do want to kind of be part of mentoring that next generation of fire scientists and especially women applied fire practitioners. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a background on fire in Canada, because for many of you, this will be maybe the first time that you're hearing about some of these things, kind of before I dive into the specifics of the research. Much of my research to date has taken place in British Columbia. So I'm going to share a little bit about it in the subboreal forests and montane forests of kind of central and northern British Columbia. BC is one of the only provinces with really full fire suppression and exclusion policies. And so this is beginning to change, but up until about the last decade, BC has been very successful at putting fires out for about 100 years. And that's both lightning and cultural fires. So they've been so successful that we've created this wildfire deficit disorder. We have large accumulations of dead and dense fuels that are, of course, the result of cumulative disturbances, insect outbreaks, wind, all these things, and of course, fire suppression. So we're not letting fires burn and they're not getting rid of those fuels. So we've created a bit of an issue here in British Columbia. And I'm sorry about my children screaming upstairs, but hopefully you won't be able to hear them too much. So when I take off, kind of that's the look at Canada, but when I take off Canada's colonial layer, you'll see that British Columbia is home to many distinct Indigenous nations, and about 95% of British Columbia is unceded, so meaning it was never legally signed away. And this is a really, really important in the context of applying fire to the land base. Much of my research is in Wet'suwet'en territory, where I'm coming from today. And as well, I work with the Cheslata and Gittinyao, where I'm beginning to kind of work closely to better understand cultural burning practices and support Indigenous-led fire stewardship, specifically the application of cultural burns. I'm going to kind of get a little bit more into that, but I want to I probably don't need to tell you this, but in case you've missed the last few years in British Columbia, we've experienced the 3 worst wildfire seasons on record, all in the last 5 years. That means we've been very, very busy. And much of this, of course, impacted all across North America. And these fires, they're not just large, they're much more impactful. So with regard to lives being lost, homes destroyed, and the number of evacuations, and of course, area burn is very significant. So although the general trend in ignitions has decreased, the annual area burn has increased. So we have a few fires that are kind of responsible for the really large areas burn. So to put this in perspective, in 2017 and 2018 and 2021, we burned about 3.5 million hectares. That's equivalent to losing all of Vancouver Island. So these are not small fires. These are very large scale disasters. And they've had a lot of cascading disturbances associated with them as well. We've had to deal with floods, with all sorts of infrastructure damage that continues today. So when I'm talking about kind of fire size increasing, I just want to also kind of put this into the context of history here is that, we are now routinely seeing fires that are greater than 100,000 hectares. We've had about 8 fires in the last 10 years that have been more than 100,000 hectares, but only 4 fires in the last 63 years that have been more than 100,000 hectares. So we're seeing this change. In 2018, the Tweedsmuir complex fire just a few hours south of here burned over 500,000 hectares. So the scale and the impact of forest we're losing is really significant in a historical context. So despite these fire seasons, kind of the general trend in the application of prescribed fire, be that habitat burning, restoration, broadcast burning, all sorts of different pile and burn, we actually have seen a huge downward trend in the application of prescribed fire on the land base, and almost none in the last 5 years, coinciding with those really extreme fire events. And so this kind of gives you an idea that British Columbia is really falling behind on the amount of fire that we put on the land. So the controlled fire. So places like Florida are leading the way in the amount of prescribed fire that is applied. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And I'm going to kind of talk about a few of them next. So kind of the take-home message for the last few slides is that we're in this new era of wildfire. So fires are becoming unsuppressible, uncontrollable, and just incredibly expensive to deal with. They're fueled by warmer and drier climate, changing fire weather, and of course, due to fire suppression. So, they've destroyed whole communities. They've resulted in direct fatalities. And of course, thousands of people have been evacuated. Smoke is becoming a significant issue. And of course, it knows no borders. And so we experience smoke from the southern US and from Siberia. And of course, we're all just sharing smoke through the summer months now. So these wildfires have disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples living in remote and forested areas. Often, these communities don't have basic access to things like clean drinking water. And so it can be really difficult to, put in capacity and infrastructure to deal with wildfires. A lot of the time, there's not even an actual fire department, or, support is coming from many, many kilometers away, often to reserves. And of course, this is made really difficult by the fact that much of the technical and place-based expertise to engage with both prescribed and cultural fires is held within Indigenous communities. So many fire practitioners there have important knowledge that has not been acknowledged by Western science, by Western fire practitioners. So you think about there being 198 nations in BC. That means there's at minimum about 198 different ways of using and understanding fire. So Indigenous fire stewardship, if you're not familiar with that term, one aspect of it is cultural burning, but it's very specific to nations and the communities that comprise a nation. So for example, in Northern British Columbia, a community that maybe primarily has a diet of caribou has a very different relationship with fire than a community that hunts moose and relies on early successional forests. So even though these may be communities that are part of the same nation, the fire practices are very specific. So it's important to remember that fire knowledge is not something that can be copied or taken from the nation that it belongs to. It's community focused, and of course it's intergenerational and used for many, many different reasons and values. So cultural burning is distinct from prescribed burning in who does it, where it's done, and for what purpose. And that's really, really important. So prescribed burning is often a wildfire mitigation tool, a restoration tool. And of course, it has many similarities to cultural burning, but it is different in its application. It's often under a fire suppression framework. And so what they do have in common is that they're almost always conducted under low risk conditions. So in Canada, significant barriers exist for revitalizing cultural burning. So I'm going to take you through kind of a few of those barriers. So this is a collaborative research project that's co-led by Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen, who's a Canadian government fire scientist, as well as other fire ecologists, lawyers, Indigenous fire practitioners from all across Canada. And so we looked at some of the significant barriers to re-engaging and revitalizing cultural burning. And I just wanted to note that we're also looking at some of the opportunities for how we can, get past some of these hurdles. So the first barrier, and this is kind of recognized from across many different communities, is just the general lack of understanding of what Indigenous fire stewardship is, and just the lack of respect for other ways of understanding fire, living with fire, and using fire. So Indigenous peoples have used fire as a tool for resource management for thousands of years, but in many places, it's still illegal to burn off the reserve. You still need to require permits to burn on Crown land or broader territories. And so this is a major hurdle. There is a lack of understanding of the relationship between Indigenous people and fire and how it supports a subsistence lifestyle. So, understanding that, yes, it is used as a wildfire mitigation tool as part of cultural burning to protect communities, but it's also a component of ceremony, of ecosystem health, of community health. So in Western society, we often have this mistrust of fire, and we often see it as kind of a frightening disaster and not a gift that can be incorporated into our daily lives. So agencies, and this is many different agencies, so I'm not just pointing fingers here, but they're often ill-equipped to engage with fire practitioners. And this also extends to non-Indigenous fire practitioners, be that ranchers or guide outfitters. So often agencies are present to supervise burns, and there can be major power imbalances that exist over accreditation, experience, and definitely knowledge. So often, agency personnel are fully dressed in protective equipment, and of course, this is required of them. Heavy machinery can be brought in, and then, of course, it's a little bit shocking when children are there in flip-flops, starting to burn under direction from their elders or their parents with dry grasses or burning sticks. And so there's this disconnect between the application of fire and the understanding of the fire risk as well. So I've actually been also at a burn where agencies said, yeah, we're ready to start the burn. And then Indigenous fire practitioners said, no, it's not right. Conditions are not right for the values that we want to see here. And so, this is after going through months of red tape to make this burn happen. But, understanding that many of the values, mushrooms, flood control, pests, soil health, those are all outside of the framework of fire suppression. And, finally, the major issue of smoke, and rightly so, of course, fear of out of control fires. It's important to communicate that cultural fire, prescribed fires are also, they're often done outside of the window of those hot summer months during good venting conditions when there's snow still on the ground. And so there's this huge void in our science communication, describing the benefits of fire, describing how it can be safely used. And as a society, just highlighting that many of us has really lost touch with connecting to ecosystems, with our once close relationship with fire. So in the last year or so, much of North America has been rushing to engage in good fire, get fire on the land base. They think, okay, well, we've got the answer now. But in many places, this has been a misstep. So again, we've undervalued that deep technical and place-based expertise that exists within Indigenous communities and within the fire practitioners that understand the many ways we can use fire. So time after time, many nations have had to deal with permits being denied. And there's a lot of frustration, and especially a lot of frustration when communities are lost. So kind of now that I've given a bit of a background on fire in BC and provided a bit of a, hopefully a clearer understanding of what Indigenous fire stewardship here, I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about some of our dendro ecological work, reconstructing historic fire activity in Tweedsmuir Park. So I'm just going to play this for you. So what you're seeing is fire every 10 years up until 2010, and then it switches to every year. So this shows just the fire perimeters of major fires here in the north since 1930. Okay. So we went in, we are conducting, and work is ongoing. We're conducting the first fire history reconstruction in Tweedsmuir Provincial Park. This is BC's largest protected area, just over 1 million hectares. And in the last 5 years or so, it's lost about half of its forested area. And surprisingly, a lot of people are saying, well, you know, that's kind of the status quo. That's where big fires happen. But without any real understanding of historic fire regimes in these subboreal and montane ecosystems, or just kind of maybe it's we're trying to blanket our understanding of fire regimes across these highly variable landscapes. I think it's important to look at kind of those last remaining old growth trees, which hold fire scars, to better understand both historic fire activity and then those potential departures from those fire regimes. And so we conducted research in the northern part of the park, again, trying to find those remnants of older forests to better reconstruct fire. Okay. So in 2018 and 2021, unfortunately, there wasn't enough resources during those really extreme wildfire season to suppress fires in the park. The park generally has a modified response plan, or let it burn, or suppression of highly, important values. And so unfortunately, when personnel and funds and aircraft are not available to suppress those fires, you get loss of those really important values, which can include endangered species. So that's kind of the last remaining ungulate winter ranges, 800-year-old whitebark pine trees. So this really highlights the issues of old growth management areas, protected areas, and kind of leaving them without engaging in proactive fire management. So protected areas in many ways are kind of these sitting ducks. And this might be kind of an unpopular opinion, but I really want to stress that we can have old growth trees, old growth forests, and have fire management within them. And so my worry is that if we wait too long, then they will be consumed by increasingly high severity stand replacing fires. So outside of these big fire scar perimeters, we were able to sample culturally modified whitebark pine trees, and these trees are examples of wood used for kindling, for trail marking, and for bark stripping. So many of these trees are over 500 years old, and fire was evident everywhere as a forest management tool. So these trees are culturally modified. They also have fire scars, and they're surrounded by other fire scarred trees. And so this really tells us this strong history of Indigenous fire management. And when we look closer at what these fire scars are telling us, and when I'm talking about fire scars, I'm talking about these. They're like healing lobes that kind of come over. They don't kill a tree, and the tree is able to withstand low severity fire events and then heal over and keep growing. And so fire, many trees, especially conifers, are really able to withstand low severity fire events. So we were able to sample 65 of these fire scarred whitebark pine trees, and they were all dead. and reconstruct 25 fire events over the last 300 years. So right in 1937, that's that purple, that's when the park's established, and we see this major decline in fire events. So there's only 2 lightning ignitions in our study area, one in 1953 and one in 1957, and then that's it. So failing to include and understand the cultural legacies of fire has really reinforced the notion that fire is rare, it's severe, and it's stand replacing. So fires in this ecosystem are, happening every 5 to 10 years in the past, prior to, that era of fire suppression. So wildfires, the high severity stand replacing wildfires, appear to be more an artifact of fire suppression. So when we look closer, we see cultural landscapes. We see late season fire scars that are likely associated with burning to increase the productivity of berry producing shrubs, to increase fodder for game. Some of these trees burned 12 times, indicating that the majority of fire events were low severity, happening every 5 to 10 years. So this fire history resembles more closely a drier ponderosa pine grassland dominated ecosystem, and not a forest with an expected fire return interval of 1 to 300 years. And this is really important. There always will be places that are kind of fire refugia that don't burn very often, but highlighting that to support large populations of people, there needed to be a lot of fire and a lot of routine application of fire. So I'm going to go even a bit broader here and talk about a review that my co-authors and I completed at the University of Waterloo to better understand the relationship between cultural burning and impacts to biodiversity. So we reviewed over 900 studies across all of Earth's terrestrial biomes, except for the tundra. It's a very underrepresented biome. And we included literature from the past 100 years across a range of temporal and spatial scales, as well as discipline, to better understand this relationship. So we really wanted to know, does cultural burning erode or enhance biodiversity? And so we considered all life forms, so mammals, insects, woody plants, microbes. And, I don't need to go into this too much because the pattern is really, really clear. It didn't matter the type of indigenous fire stewardship. It could be swidden or terra preta or slash and burn. 85% of studies reported increases in various metrics of biodiversity. So woody plants were the most common life form studied, and we saw a lot of increase in biodiversity associated with them. And so studies reported several different uses of fire. There's many commonalities in how fire is used in grassland savanna or temperate rainforest or even boreal rainforest. So clearing the land was the most common use of fire, and all studies really confirmed that the cultural burning took place outside of the window of uncontrollable fire activity. So whether that's the wet season, during winter, or when snow was still on the ground. And we've actually taken this and we've taken it and tried to communicate it better to children grades 4 to 7 and highlight the benefits and the importance of fire, so good fire, and of course, cultural burning to biodiversity and why it's so important to both human ecological communities. And so that will hopefully be coming into the school curriculum in BC next year. And so just want to highlight that, there's so many different uses of fire across the world, and we often, only can think of a few of them, but many values are really important. So take-home message of that work is that if low severity fire was applied as part of a system of fire stewardship, it increased biodiversity and habitat heterogeneity across all the terrestrial biomes that we looked at. And that was while reducing wildfire risk to communities. So we understand the patterns, the knowledge gaps are becoming a bit more clear, and we have some solutions. I guess the next question is where do we go from here? So We have about 100-year backlog of fuels that we need to clean up in North America. So I think, fire suppression has ultimately failed. We need to get to work, and we need to make sure that we're preparing for the inevitable, which is increased fire activity. So there's major issues with waste wood, with fuel accumulation in forests around communities, with fuel across broader landscapes, and how to deal with it. Collaborative research and innovative approaches are really needed. And of course, this work needs to happen at a very large scale. One thing that I really realized in fire ecology is really the importance of boundary spanners in fire extension and communication. So fire is still really controversial. And we need to kind of take this well-established science and make sure that it's informing policy, and make sure it's translated well to the public and policymakers using it to support the application of fire and to support fire practitioners. So boundary spanners are pretty rare. They're underutilized, but they can play significant roles in tackling environmental problems. So we have a really important place in straddling the divide between scientists and non-scientists, between scientists and policy, between scientists and stakeholder groups. There's so many different ways to bridge these gaps. And the reason I've included images here is that there's this really strong scientific support for effective fuel mitigation and controlled fire. But we still are spending tons of money on fire suppression. And it's really important. Fire suppression will always exist. We're always going to need to, make sure that we're looking after values, make sure that we're protecting homes. But we're really kind of stuck on the notion that controlled fire is bad. And just to put, the economic argue in here. So studies in the US have come out with the fact that it costs about 200 acres to mitigate fuel and use controlled fire to reduce wildfire risk. But it costs about $800 an acre to suppress that fire. So the math is in, the science is in, it's all kind of coming together. How can we make it happen? And one idea is to establish more of a Pyrodiversity atlas throughout our forests in British Columbia that will allow a greater understanding of the basics of burning, because I don't think that we're super familiar with that. So how often does this forest need to be burned? Why? What for? What species are going to be coming back after a fire? And also to provide an understanding of burning within the context of a changing climate. So the times when we've known it's time to burn in the past, that's changing. And so understanding, if we want these values, do we need to move this berry patch up the slope, or do we need to burn earlier? And so incorporating different understanding of what these successful burns mean. How often, where do we need to treat working forests to prepare them for wildfire? What are we monitoring for? And of course, how can we monitor across these values? And so I think the big question is do we need to change what we're doing? Do we need to invest more in fire science? And then also just really focusing on really defining that success and making sure it's individual to a burn. So does it mean the deer came back? Or does it mean there's a new firekeeper in a community? Or does it mean that we have the public come out and participate in that burn? And so much of the fire prescriptions that exist are really within that framework of fire suppression. Cultural fire prescriptions or alternative prescriptions, even for ranchers, for guide outfitters, they don't always align with those fire suppression values and those definitions of success. So, we want to know, did that invasive species actually get killed? Or do we need to plant trees and burn, or burn and then replant? These are important things that are not well known. So it's really critical to the future planning of fire. And the planning phase really needs to incorporate these. And the monitoring phase really needs to have a different timestamp on it. That might not just be great, we got the burn done. It might be like, well, how did the forest recover 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we applied more fire to it? And so I think another really important component of this is we need to listen to underrepresented voices and experiences in fire. And of course, support other ways of understanding fire. So there's major power imbalances that exist in the fire world. But women and people from underrepresented groups really, again, bring that diverse perspective. They usually improve safety, they advocate for inclusion, and they bring innovation to dealing with wildfire problems. And so, unfortunately, the narrative of fire has been shaped by these very frightening wildfire events that you see on the news. You know, if this is when you turn on the news in 2021, this is what you saw. And if this is the only thing that you saw, you'd probably be a little bit scared. But there's another version. So these are also headlines that are from 2021. And, you know, if we're a part of a future that reads like this, I think that we would be kind of entering that new fire reality and that new approach to fire that I'm very excited to be part of. So I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. And I just really want to highlight some of the amazing authors that have contributed so much to this research and to my own understanding of fire over the years. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kira.